Paul, what's your last name, Paul? Briette. Briette. Brouillette, is a Kerouac specialist bibliographer of French-Canadian origin from Lowell, Massachusetts. So if you have any specialized questions, you can ask him, because he knows that field better than I do, probably. And between us, we're working up a bibliography for the 40s, 50s, well, we got the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, which is quite a lot of reading. And I'll try and cover each decade, because it's a logical story. I want to continue, however, with the gists of visions of Vanity of Douloise, which we're having trouble getting a hold of other copies of. So I'll read in and out of it. On page 86, at least you can take notes in case you ever want to check back on, check back on the book. I think it's out of print, from what I'm told. Totally out of print? Even in England? In England. By whom? Page 86 of the original hardcover. Coward McGann, 1968. A sort of visionary description by Kerouac of something correlating with what the upstairs guru is talking about these Tuesdays and Friday nights. If any of you are listening to Ursel Tenzing's lectures, he's been talking about first noble truth, truth of suffering, or dissatisfaction, or some slight emptiness, or gap, or beauty that must die, joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, with aching pleasure nigh, Keats's Ode on Melancholy. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, an aching pleasure nigh. Aching pleasure. So aching pleasure, the first noble truth. Even in bliss there's suffering, aching pleasure. Ain't it the truth? As anybody who's been in bed with more than one person at a time will tell you. So even if you get your wildest daydream orgy going, it's lots of trouble. So, the morning after, or at the very moment, anyway, the exposition upstairs of the Buddhist universe involves some sense of gap, that even at the moment of greatest pleasure or fulfillment, there's a certain empty center or space or gap of which one becomes conscious and through which one becomes conscious of the moment, maybe some perturbation or disturbance which leads one to think. The contention last night, or on Tuesday upstairs, was that the animal world was too full of suffering for anybody to take time out enough to realize the basic difficulty and dissatisfaction of existence to begin with. So there was so much suffering in the animal world, it was too speedy. You didn't get a chance to stop and think. The advantage of the human world is that you can stop and think. So here's Kerouac stopping and thinking. One night, my cousin Blanche came to the house and sat in the kitchen talking to Mom among the packing boxes. I sat on the porch outside and leaned way back with my feet on the rail and gazed at the stars for the first time in my life. A clear August night, the stars, the Milky Way, the whole works clear. I stared and stared until they stared back at me. Where the hell was I, and what was all this? I went into the parlor and sat down in my father's old, deep, easy chair and fell into the wildest daydream of my life. This is important, and this is the key to the story, wifey dear. As Ma and cousin talked in the kitchen, I daydreamed I was now going back to Columbia for my sophomore year, with a home in New Haven, maybe near Yale campus, with soft light in room and rain on the sill, mist on the pane, and go all the way in football and in studies. I was going to be such a sensational runner that we'd win every game against Dartmouth, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Georgia U, Michigan U, Cornell, the bloody lot, and wind up in the Rose Bowl. In the Rose Bowl, worse even than Cliff Montgomery, I was going to run wild. Uncle Lou Libble, for the first time in his life, would throw his arms around me and weep, the coach. Even his wife would do so. The boys on the team would raise me up in the Rose Bowl's Pasadena Stadium and march me to the showers, singing. On returning to Columbia campus in January, having passed chemistry with an A, I would then idly turn my attention to winter indoor track and decide on the mile and run it in under 4 flat. That was fast in those days. So fast indeed that I'd be in the big meets at Madison Square Garden and beat the current great milers in final fantastic sprints, bringing my time down to 3:50 flat. By this time, everybody in the world is crying, Duluaz, Duluaz. But unsatisfied, I idly go out in the spring for the Columbia baseball team and bat home runs clear over the Harlem River, 1 or 2 a game, including fast breaks from the bag to steal from first to second, from second to third, and finally, in the climactic game from third to home, zip, slide, dust, boom. Now, the New York Yankees are after me. They want me to be their next Joe DiMaggio. I idly turned that down because I want Columbia to go to the Rose Bowl again in 1943. Ha! But then I also, in mad midnight musings over a Faustian skull, after drawing circles on the earth, talking to God in the tower of the Gothic high church steeple of Riverside Church, meeting Jesus on the Brooklyn Bridge, getting Sebastian Sampras apart on Broadway as Hamlet, playing King Lear myself across the street, I've become the greatest writer that ever lived and write a book so golden and so purchased with magic that everybody smacks their brows on Madison Avenue. Is chasing after me on his crutches on the Columbia campus. Mike Hennessy, his father's hand in hand, comes screaming down the dorm steps to find me. All the kids of Horace Mann are singing in the field. Bravo, bravo, author. They're yelling for me in the theater where I've also presented my newest idol work, a play rivaling Eugene O'Neill and Maxwell Anderson and making Strindberg spin. Finally, a delegation of cigar-chewing guys come and get me and want to know if I want to train for the world's heavyweight boxing championship fight with Joe Louis. Okay, I train idly in the Catskills, come down on a June night, face big tall Joe as the referee gives us instructions, and then when the bell rings, I rush out real fast and just pepper him real fast and so hard that he actually goes back bouncing over the ropes and into the third row and lays there knocked out. I'm the world's heavyweight boxing champion, the greatest writer, the world's champ miler, Rose Bowl, and pro-bound with the New York Giants football nonpareil, now offered every job on every paper in New York. And what else? Tennis, anyone? I woke up from this daydream suddenly realizing that all I had to do was go back on the porch and look at the stars again, which I did, and still they just stared at me blankly. In other words, I suddenly realized that all my ambitions, no matter how they come out, and of course, as you can see from the preceding narrative, they just come out fairly ordinary, it wouldn't matter anyway in the intervening space between human breathings and the sigh of the happy star, so to speak, to quote Thoreau again. It just didn't matter what I did, anytime, anywhere, with anyone. Life is funny, like I said. I suddenly realized that we were all crazy and had nothing to work for except the next meal and the next good sleep. Oh, God in heavens, what a fumbling, hand-hanging, goof world it is, that people actually think they can gain anything from either this or that, or this or that, and in so doing corrupt their sacred graves in the name of sacred grave corruption? Chemistry, shemistry, football, schmutball. The war must have been getting in my bones. When I looked up from that crazy reverie at the stars, heard my mother and cousins still yakking in the kitchen about tea leaves, heard, in fact, my father yelling across the street in the bowling alley, I realized either I was crazy or the world was crazy, and I picked on the world. And of course I was right. Well, that's like an early, it's archetypal. I guess everybody's had that daydream, or one form of it or other. And he's given very honestly, archetypally his own, idly, as he says. As he actually idly did become a great, world's greatest novelist, so to speak. But having carried his archetypal fantasy to the extreme and been mindful of it and even playful with it and humorous about it, so he came to a sort of strange conclusion, having played out the possibility of gain to the very end, and then coming to the emptiness at the end again. That informs almost all of his writing and all of his life from there on. The emptiness at the end of gain, or rack my hand with labor of nada. Run 100-yard dash and old ensenada. So what's to do with all this gin and tonics, persimmonics, twab, twab, twabble all day? That's Mexico City blues. So what'll I do? Run 100-yard dash and old ensenada? Rack my hand with labor of nada? So even the writing finally is rack my hand with labor of nada. Nada, nothing. Nice vowels. That was one of my favorite lines in Kerouac. Rack my hand with labor of nada. So it actually, this is the explanation, or an exposition of all the daydream and then the consideration and bethought me's and third thoughts that lead to that empty disillusionment, which is, well, a high school disillusionment for him, but also is like right on the nose of his later Buddhist studies and our later Buddhist studies.
Do you think that like that whole rack my hands with the labor of nada being the idea of pursuing maybe the vanity half of that personality, as opposed to, he mentions later in the book, talks about what it would take for him to be a true Christian, so to speak.
Oh, this is vanity of Duluaz.
Yeah, in the end.
Yeah.
In the end, he starts talking about that. And
yeah.
I just started to see the two. You know, he went after, more or less, he pursued his writing, you know, and ended up being the big boohoo Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
And then talked about the loneliness and the emptiness of that at the end, and kind of bewailed the fact that he couldn't muster it up himself to take on the spiritual teachings of a Buddhism or even his own Christianity.
Yeah.
So do you also see that kind of a playoff?
Well,
it's like it's the next to last page.
Yeah, the next to last page. I was looking over that the other day. When his father is buried, so the undertakers come and dump him in the basket, and we have him all hearsed up to the cemetery in New Hampshire, in the town where he was born, and the little idiot birds are singing on the branch. At one point, the blue jay mother throws the weakling out of the nest, and he falls to the foot of the tree and thrashes there, dying and starving. A priest tries to console me. I walk with my uncle Vincent Duluaz after the funeral through the little streets of Nashua and understand, from his silence, why he was always considered the mean and uncommunicative Duluaz. He was the honest one. He said, "Your father was a good boy, but he was too ambitious and proud and crazy. I guess you're the same." "I don't know," says Jack. "Well, in between. I never disliked Emil, but there you have it, and him, and I'm dying myself, and you'll die someday, and all this poof s'en va. All this poof it goes." He made a Breton Gallic shrug at the empty blue sky above. Of Uncle Vincent, you could not say that he was a victim of the vanity of Duluaz. But I was still a victim. Went back to Ozone Park with Ma and did her spring house cleaning. The old man gone, cleaned the house, drive the Celtic ghosts out, and I settled down to write in solitude and pain, writing hymns and prayers even at dawn, thinking, when this book is finished, which is going to be the sum and substance and crap of everything I've been through throughout this whole goddamn life, I shall be redeemed. But wifey, I did it all. I wrote the book. I stalked the streets, talking about the town and the city, which includes a giant account of his father's death and of meeting Burroughs and Hunky and myself. I stalked the streets of life, of Manhattan, of Long Island, stalked through 1,183 pages of my first novel and sold the book, got an advance, whooped, hallelujah, went on, did everything you're supposed to do in life, but nothing ever came of it. No generation is new. There's nothing new under the sun. All is vanity. Little quotation marks around the biblical quotes. And last chapter, XV of Book 13. Forget it, wifey, go to sleep. Tomorrow's another day. Hic calix. Look that up in Latin. It means, here's the chalice. Be sure there's wine in it. And he died a year later of overdrinking. So, well, what? Hard to tell. Your question is, was it the vanity of writing? Or was it the writing? Or is there some separation? Is there any way of doing...
There's even a part where in the beginning, I guess somebody with a spiritual bent wrote a letter to him, a woman wrote a letter to him and said that there was essentially no Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac never existed, that type of thing. And he went into an explanation of it.
We got pissed off at that.
Yeah, and he ended up saying something like, who is he that is not he because of an idiot's ignorance? Like trying to defend that whole kind of attachment to...
Yeah, I'll read that. It's a very funny thing. But I couldn't figure out what this phrase meant there. Including an attack on communism, because he really like sourpuss at that point. The reason I'm so bitter, and as I said, in anguish nowadays, or one of the reasons, is that everybody's begun to lie, and because they lie, they assume that I lie too. They overlook the fact that I remember very well many things. The rhetoric here is the rhetoric of je me souviens très bien, beaucoup de choses, which is actually a paraphrase of Louis Ferdinand Céline's prose, which is, Céline was on our reading list, and I suggest you go check out The Journey to the End of the Night, New Directions, Louis Ferdinand Céline. I think it's New Directions. Or Mort à Crédit, Death on the Installment Plan. Those are basic reference, attitudinal reference books, as well as prose reference books for all of Kerouac's prose and all of Burroughs' prose. And I understand that Gregory Corso, in his Socratic poetry rap of the second session this summer, will be assigning later books, I think Guignol's Band or Castle to Castle, by Louis Ferdinand Céline. Nord. And Michael Brownstein has been using Céline as a basic text in his prose. So I guess for the Kerouac school, Céline is a foundation stone. Dr. Ferdinand Destouches, who wrote under the pseudonym Louis Ferdinand Céline, who had somewhat of a paranoid attitude, as Kerouac had a little elegant touch of in his toping old age. The reason I'm so bitter, and as I said, in anguish, they assume I lie too. They overlook the fact that I remember very well many things. Of course, I've forgotten some, like that football score, but I do believe that lying is a sin, unless it's an innocent lie based on lack of memory. Certainly, the giving of false evidence and being a false witness is a mortal sin. If he heard me on this scene here, he'd turn over in his grave. A mortal sinner, Ginsberg. But what I mean is, insofar as lying has become so prevalent in the world today, thanks to Marxian dialectical propaganda and Comintern techniques, among other causes, in parenthesis, that when a man tells the truth, everybody looking in the mirror and seeing a liar assumes the truth teller is lying too. Dialectical materialism and the Comintern techniques were the original tricks of the Bolshevist communism. That is, you have the right to lie if you're on the Bolshevitsky side. End parenthesis. Thus, that awful new saying, "You're putting me on." My name is Jack Kerouac, and I was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, on 9 Lupine Road on March 12, 1922. Oh, you're putting me on. I wrote this book, The Vanity of Douloise. Oh, you're putting me on. It's like that woman, wifey, who wrote me a letter a while ago saying, of all things, listen to this. You're not Jack Kerouac. There is no Jack Kerouac. His books were not even written. They just suddenly appeared on a computer, she probably thinks. They were programmed. They were fed informative, confused data by mad, bespectacled, egghead sociologists, and out of the computer came the full manuscript, all neatly typed double-space, for the publisher's printer to simply copy and the publisher's binder to read and the publisher to distribute with cover and blurb jacket. So this inexistent Jack Kerouac could not only receive $2 royalty check from Japan, but also this woman's letter. Now, David Hume was a great philosopher and Buddha was right in the eternal sense, but this is going a little bit too far. Of course, it's true that my body is nothing but an electromagnetic gravitational field like that yonder table. And of course, it's true that mind is really non-existent in the sense of the old Dharma masters like Wei Nang. But on the other hand, who is he that is not he because of an idiot's ignorance? The idiot woman's ignorance. I refuse to be a void on account of that woman anyway, for other reasons, he's saying. Who is he that is not he because of an idiot's ignorance? Do you understand that way?
See, no, I took just in the idea of his own self, like the idea of, being caught up and being really attached to the drama of his own life and his own suffering, getting kind of stuck on that first noble truth, and never really being able to break through it because he's got it's in his mind right up until his last days. I mean, in that whole little section he gets into Christianity and talking about it, and it just.
That's actually quite interesting that he's speaking in a way so offhandedly and elegantly of Wei Nang, Dharma masters. By this time, it's years, maybe 12, 13 years since he considered himself a Buddhist, but he's still in his mind. Although he puts down the Christians also as any religion, the priests and all that. There's a little small vision of all the boys in school on page 96. Yeah, he just ran away from the football team. Okay, be back at 8. And I went out, the coach tells him, be back at 8. And I went out and took the subway down to Brooklyn with all my gear, whipped out a few dollars from the suitcase, said goodbye to Uncle Nick, saying I was going back to Bakerfield, walked down the hot September streets of Brooklyn, hearing Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech about I hate war, coming out of every barbershop in Brooklyn, took the subway to 8th Avenue Greyhound bus station, and bought a ticket to the South. I wanted to see the Southland and start my career as an American careener. So that's how he got started on the road. That was the most important decision of my life so far. What was I doing telling everybody to go? What I was doing was telling everybody to go jump in the big fat ocean of their own folly. I was also telling myself to go jump in the big fat ocean of my own folly. What a bath! It was delightful. I was washed clean. Then having gotten out into America, there's a little section where he gets very early disillusionment on his first trip. There's a disillusionment with America as a poem. I mean, he's pronounced America as a poem, or he learned from Woolf that America could be read as a poem or seen as a poem, but also instantly a disillusionment with that, which on large scale, incidentally, is reflected in Gregory Corso's Elegiac Feelings American, which was Corso's book written after Kerouac's death, and which, like Shelley writing an ode on Keats, Corso has an elegy on Kerouac's death, as Shelley has an Adonais, an elegy on Keats's death. And I think Corso's is in the grand tradition of like great poets' elegies for other late lamented dear great poets. But the point that Corso makes there is that when the singer, if the singer is a singer of the nation, and if the nation decays, then what happens to the singer? So that early disillusionment is reflected in Book 6 of Vanity of Doulois, or at least detected early by hindsight in a late work relating back to his high school days and college days. It was November. It was cold. It was wood smoke. It was swift waters in the wink of silver glare with its rose headband out yonder where Eve's star, some call it Venus, some call it Lucifer, stoppered up her drooling propensities and tried to contain itself in one delimited throb of boiling light. He's still capable of that, and like dying, or perhaps a year before his death, he's still capable of his little cadenzas about the star. It's really pretty. I stopped and reread it. It was November, it was cold, it was wood smoke, it was swift waters in the wink of silver glare, with its rose headband out yonder where Eve's star stoppered up her drooling propensities and tried to contain herself in one delimited throb of boiling light. Boiling light's pretty. It's just pure invention there. Well, so it's actually his whole attitude toward writing, or his whole practice over decades and decades and millions of pages, actually. I guess, millions of words, and I think a million pages at least, of just writing. Comes to that delimited throb of boiling light, just easily tossed off the fountain pen. Ah, poetic. His next line, ah, poetic. I keep saying ah, poetic, because I didn't intend this to be a poetic paean of a book. In 1967, I didn't intend this to be a poetic paean of a book. In 1967, as I'm writing this, what possible feeling can be left in me for an America that has become such a potboiler of broken convictions, messes of rioting and fighting in the streets, hoodlumism, cynical administration of cities and states, suits and neckties the only feasible subject? Grandeur all gone with the mosaic mesh of television, mosaic indeed with a capital M, where people screw their eyes at all those dots and pick out hallucinated images of their own contortion and are fed Achtung, attention, attention, instead of, dreamy real wet lips beneath an old apple tree? Or that picture in Time magazine a year ago showing 1,000 cars parked in a redwood forest in California, all alongside similar tents with awnings and Primus stoves? Everybody dressed alike, looking around everywhere at everybody with those curious new eyes of the second part of this century, only occasionally looking up at the trees, and if so, probably thinking, oh, how nice that redwood would look as my lawn furniture. Well enough for now. That's page 105, 106. Main thing is coming home. Farewell song sweet from my trees of the previous August was washed away in November joys. And he comes back home having quit the team and having goofed up and having run away and having gone down south. This is interesting because I remember trips like this where he had some occasion to be around and do something, and all of a sudden he disappeared, cut out and go on an adventure, and I said, oh, God damn it, he's irresponsible, undisciplined. Yep.
You are still tight with Jack around when he was writing Vanity of Doulois?
Well, he was living in Florida. When he was writing this, I was in Europe with my family. When I got back, we talked to each other on the phone a lot, actually. And that year, actually, I saw him. He came up north to do a program with, the next year I saw him, 68, when we got back from, I hadn't seen him about a year, I think, year and a half. But he used to phone in the middle of the night, drunk, and really insulting, and angry. What are you doing, you fucking faggot communist Jew now? I'm with my mother. I'm not going to do to my mother what you did with yours. I'm not going to throw my mother to the dogs of eternity. I remember that, yeah. Well, actually, 1962, he came in drunk to where Peter and I were living on East 2nd Street. Kind of awkward, disturbing. I had this little household that I was trying to keep going, as he had his household. If you came in his household to his mother's place and you made a mess or made a lot of noise and went whoopee, he'd freak out. So he came to, so he, what he did is freaking out in other people's households. So he came in to our household, and Peter had a virgin sister who was training to be a baby nurse, sleeping in one of the rooms. And Kerouac went in. What did he do to Marie? Some great traumatic boogeyman shot, which he thought was funny, being drunk, which scared her. Back to the bug house, anyway. And I started screaming, "What are you doing in my house? At this hour, 4 o'clock, what are you..." He fell down on the kitchen floor laughing and said, "Ginsberg, you're a hairy loss." Which was really perfect, unstoppable, total. I mean, I've never been better lost by any Zen master or lama. And it was the same lost. It's the same absence. I really resented it at the moment. Being called a hairy loss. I didn't realize it was absolutely true. I mean, it was inevitably true. So from 62 on, the relationship was of that nature, contentious, sometimes close, funny, odd. Occasionally he'd come by like really drunk and want me to blow him, and get very insistent. "Nobody loves me. Come on, give me a blowjob. You're a fairy. Give me a blowjob. Nobody loves me. I'm too fat and old and red-faced. I'm lonesome." Careless. And he didn't give a shit anymore, what I thought or anybody thought. I think, yes, he was by 60. Well, in 1960, the book Big Sur, he registers himself as an alcoholic, then coming off and on and off and on. But I think there was considerable drinking from then on, so that basically he was afraid to come into town, because when he came into the city from Northport, Long Island, or from Cape Cod, where he was living, or from Florida going into town, he would get into trouble in the bars drinking too much. And people beat him up or insulted him, or he got into problems. I didn't see him enough in bars in those last years to know, but I kept hearing rumors. So most of a lot of our communication was just telephone. Maybe how often? Once every couple weeks.
Couple weeks in the middle of the night.
Yeah, because he was up in the middle of the night reading. Reading or writing, and then he'd get maybe on Benzedrine or a call or Lush. And then very funny conversations. He would, I thought he was being mean to me over and over again. You stole that line about kind king light of mine. That was my line. So I got very upset, because I thought we were, just like Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, just trading phrases, because he took phrases from me, I found out. But he kept accusing me of stealing a plagiarism of his phrases, which I found was probably true. I took it much more unconsciously than I was conscious of. But he thought it was some kind of stealing rather than just natural absorption. And so he would, every time he called, he would put me down. So finally I realized what this key was. And I said, so he said something to me about, "Ginsberg, what are you hanging around with all those dirty Jew communists anyway?" So I said, "What the fuck, is that what your mother put in your mouth? Tell your mother she's got a dirty cunt, and I'm gonna shove a Coke bottle in it and put some gasoline and explode it if she doesn't stop eating your ass out." And he started laughing. And all of a sudden got very, 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 very sort of like friendly and pleasant, began talking common sense instead of the usual contentious macho trading of ego pinpricking. So I found what he was actually doing was just seeing how much ego I got and how much attached to it I was, and if I could be upset still. Until I finally, just one day, just slipped over the other side and just laid it back on him, realizing he was just being playful with me rather than really mean. Or it seemed finally to be playfulness rather than meanness. That I was so hung up that I really would get insulted, by this improvised Rabelaisian gibberish, with whatever little insight it had coming through unconsciously. Like, yes, I was hanging around with aggressive, mean, nasty, hairy, communist, Jewish troublemakers like Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, and I was another one of them, as he insisted, and it was all true. But he didn't give a shit. It was just, I thought it was so important that we were all such clean angels or something. So I think it was only when I just turned it back on him, just gave him back the same, that I realized he'd all the time been like much more aware and less drunk than I thought. Or just looser. I was a little scared of that looseness. Because it also seems like dissolution too, which it was partly. It's hard to tell when you have somebody who's a genius and who's a drunk, or mad, or genius, or sane, or whatever. It's hard to tell the difference between total sanity, such as you might find in a drunken Tibetan Lama, or meanness, such as you might find in a drunken Tibetan Lama, or anybody. So where do you draw the line? Everybody knows somebody that's absolutely great, that they're in love with, who's an alcoholic, or their uncle, or their last girlfriend, or boyfriend, or their ex-junkie lover, or whatever. Guy who beat you for all your money and took your stash and all your phonograph records and your bank book and your diamond ring and went away. The day after you had decided you'd all get married or something. Had to figure, it was his habit. I had an excuse. Well, how do you draw the line between complete honesty and disillusionment? Disillusionment. Complete honesty and disillusionment, or drunken soul. I don't know. I guess we all have the same problem. Or do we? I don't know. We all encounter this same situation, I think. I never solved the problem. Because when I read his books, I always realize that he was enormously, broodingly vaster of mind and heart than myself. And that my irritation was jejune and egoistic and self-defensive and contributed to his death and disillusionment. So I always feel guilty. On the other hand, occasionally I come up against when I realize he was full of shit. And vain. Totally vain. That whole thing wasn't wisdom at all. It was like some kind of complete paranoid vanity, and that's why it rubbed so badly. See, that's why it wasn't skillful means, so to speak. That's why he drank himself to death. I'll find some occasion in here to point out the vanity. I mean, the whole book, he's saying it himself, the vanity of Dulawas. Well, hit Kalex, make sure the wine's full. Of course, I don't know, maybe from some supreme high teacup Ignu Vajrayana viewpoint that is ultimate wisdom. But given the situation that here we all are decades later with something to do, that doesn't seem to be, well, as he said to Carl Solomon, this madhouse shot of yours is not exactly the immemorial miel. Miel is French for honey. This madhouse shot of yours is not exactly the immemorial honey. I.e., Carl kept saying that he was crazy and had to go back to the bug house year after year, decade after decade. That was his whole literary art, was like all sorts of essays about going back to the bug house. Or what was wrong with society, or was his nose too big, or was it society had a wrong appreciation of noses? You might check out Carl Solomon's Mishaps, perhaps, which the library now has copies of. Writings that go back to the 40s and mostly 47, 48, a little later than this period we're talking about. So Jack wrote to Carl, or told me to tell Carl, or wrote in a book which I brought Carl, I think, this madhouse, a great classic slogan, this madhouse shot of yours is not exactly the immemorial miel. It's not exactly the immemorial honey. This hic calyx shot of yours is not exactly the immemorial honey, the immemorial ambrosia, it might be said. Otherwise, we're not sitting here. I walked Moody Street at midnight in bright moonlight. I walked Moody Street over crunching snow and felt something awful that had not been in Lowell before. For one thing, I was the failure back in town. Quote, the failure back in town. For another, I had lost the glamour of New York and the Columbia campus and the tweeted outlook of sophomores, had lost glittering Manhattan, was back trudging among the brick walls of the mills. He came back, since he'd cut out of Columbia, he'd already sort of broken that pattern of Fitzgeraldian novelistic fantasy nostalgia that he'd started out, and now was into some kind of awful grit of having to face the solitude of actually being a writer or a worker, and not just going through on sliding along on the fantasy of youth time romance with money, making it all right. The tweeded look of sophomores, the glamour of the tweeded look of sophomores. He has got some suggestions for writers here, since he's just describing a time when his writing begins getting codified, clarified, his method. That's how writers begin. By imitating the masters, without suffering like said masters, till they learn their own style. And by the time they learn their own style, there's no more fun in it, because you can't imitate any other master's suffering but your own. So he's saying it's all right, begin by imitating the masters, but then when you get your own suffering, you have your own suffering to write about. And there's no more fun in it. Rack my hand. That's page 109. Then he actually examines his own early writings, his own diaries of age, I guess 18, 19. When he went out on the sea transport, military sea transport. All eyes peeled for the periscope. Wonderful evening spent before with the, not Navy, excuse me, Army gun crew near the big gun playing popular records on the phonograph. The Army fellows seem much more sincere than the hardened, cynical dock rats. Here's a few notes from my own personal log. So here's at the age of 46. Saying, here's a few notes from my own personal log of my Salinger-esque days of 1938. Quote, there are a few acceptable men here and there, like Don Gary, the new scullion, a sensible and friendly fellow. He has a wife in Scotland, joined the merchant marine to get back to Scotland, in fact. I met one of the passengers or construction workers, an Arnold Gershon, an earnest youth from Brooklyn. That's pretty good, actually, for... I guess it's his earliest journals, or not earliest, but his late teenage journals going aboard a ship. And another fellow works in the butcher shop. Outside of these, my acquaintances have so far been fruitless, almost foolish. I am trying hard to be sincere, but the crew prefers, I suppose, embittered cursing and bawdy foolishness. Well, at least, being misunderstood is being like the hero in the movies. Can you imagine such a crap written in a scullion's diary? That's his 1967 comment on that. I'm trying hard to be sincere, but the crew prefers, I suppose, embittered cursing and bawdry foolishness. Well, at least being misunderstood is like being the hero in the movies. Can you imagine such crap written in a scullion's diary? I think it's kind of interesting because he's mixing his old early diary writing, and then the old master is now adding on little phrases to hop it up a little bit to make it funnier, or parody it, or add on, or just being playful, quoting himself at 18 and then being playfully adding on some late cadenza. So I'll read this paragraph. Can you imagine such crap written in a scullion's diary? End parenthesis. Sunday, July 26th. A beautiful day, clear and windy with a choppy sea that looks like a marine painting, long flecked billows of blue water, with the wake of our ship like a bright green road. Nova Scotia to larboard. We have now passed up the Cabot Straits. 1967. Who's Cabot? A Breton? Pronounced Cabot. Cabot Straits. Quote, back to 39. Up we go to northern seas. Ah, there you'll find that shrouded Arctic, unquote. That wash of pronounced sea talk. That parturient snow-mad ice mountain plain, that bloody Genghis Khan plain of seaweed talk broken only by uprisings of foam. There's a little parenthesis he threw in on top of his journal. it's funny, his pure appreciation of vowels and the babble of the mind, the playfulness of it, and the easiness of the writing of this. Up we go to northern seas. Ah, there you'll find that shrouded Arctic, written in 1938. And then his comment, that wash of pronounced sea talk, that parturient snow-mad ice mountain plain, that bloody Genghis Khan plain of seaweed talk, broken only by uprisings of foam, and parentheses, with all the implication there also of, like, it all comes to nothing in the end. Great uprisings of foam. Yes, sir, boy, the earth is an Indian thing, but the waves are Chinese. Know what that means? Ask the guys who drew those old scrolls, or the old fishermen in Cathay. And what Indian ever dared to sail to Europe or Hawaii from the sullen, tumbling streams of North America? When I say Indian, I mean Ogag. Ogalag. There's that alcoholical, mouthy playfulness. When I say Indian, I mean Ogalag. The earth is an Indian thing, I think, is a line originally from, a favorite line of Kerouac's, from probably On the Road somewhere. Does anybody know that line? The earth is an Indian thing?
Well, it's in, On the Road, it's also in Lonesome Traveler.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in On the Road.
Yeah, it's in On the Road.
I wonder if he put it in later. I don't know if he wrote it out then as part of it, or I mean, there were a few phrases he did add in, but maybe in Lonesome Traveler. Brakeman on the Railroad, is it in? Or what?
No.
What is it?
There's a trip to Mexico.
Oh,
Fellaheen.
Yeah. You know that word Fellaheen, where that comes from?
No, I don't.
Fellaheen comes out of Spengler, out of the book, the big two volumes in one of Spengler that Burroughs handed him when we went to visit Burroughs. Fellaheen is a word that Spengler uses for the non-city, the peasant pastoral outside of the cities, the people that have been there, that are the same in Mexico, Egypt, Peru, China, people living diurnally by the seasons, by the plants, by planting, by crops, by market, outside of the centers of sophisticated power and the uprisings of foam of the central cities. So I guess Kerouac was identifying himself more and more with Fellaheen. And the earth is an Indian thing. Actually, contact with the earth, as in America, I didn't know what he meant. I got mad when I heard him say that first. Actually, I was always getting mad at his works of genius. When I first heard him say that, I thought he meant, white people are not supposed to be here, only the Indians have the earth. The earth is owned by the Indians. The earth is an Indian thing. Then later it got to mean to me, oh, the Indians are, walk. They know their own geography. They know all the buds and the plants and the medicines, and so they actually know, and the earth is an Indian thing. I mean, or like saying the earth is a gardener's thing, or the earth is a... For some reason or other, I took it as political at first, as some anti-Semitic comment. It was my paranoia when I first heard it. But so then years later, yes, sir, boy, the earth is an Indian thing, but the waves are Chinese. I don't know what that meant either. You know what that means? Ask the guys who drew those old scrolls. Well, of course, the Chinese waves and the old scrolls are little squiggles of penmanship. Then there's an odd little moment when he's talking about little thing about a little flash revealing his ideas about LSD. He's still quoting his old journal about on being on a ship going past Greenland or Labrador, and there are depth charges booming out, trying to get German submarines. As I was writing just now, we should be off the coast of Labrador tomorrow. As I was writing just now, I heard a hissing outside my porthole. You're following this. This is his early journal that he's quoting in his 1967 writing. As I was writing just now, I heard a hissing outside my porthole. The sea is heavy. The ship just rocks and rocks real deep, and I thought, torpedo. I waited for one long second. Death, death. And then, in parenthesis, 1967, think of your death scenes and death strips, LSD users, in parenthesis. I tell you, says confident young Jack London in his bunk, I tell you it is not hard to face death. No siree, 1967. Quote, I am patient, I shall now turn over to sleep, and the sea washes on, immense, endless, everlasting, my sweet brother, question mark, and sentencer, exclamation point, sentencer. In the moonlight now in these dangerous waters, one can see the two Navy ships that are convoying us, two tawny sea cats alert and low-slung, unquote. Oh, gee. 1967, oh, gee. Homeless waters in the north, the Aryan Nordic up against his chappy sea-net hands. There's a little comment at the end. Then he got into the chappy sea-net hands. What's that all about? So the next chapter is just pure messing around. I guess he must have got drunk. Each one of the method of writing, incidentally, is useful to know. I think for all of his books, actually. But I notice it specifically here. It's divided into, this book is divided into something like 13 books altogether. Then each book within it is divided into anywhere between 5 and 13 little chapterettes inside it. And what each chapterette is, of 1 page or half a page or 2 pages, is one session of writing, wherever the writing leads. No, that's how the book is composed. One day you write, well, you sit down, he's tired, he's not a great big Thomas Hardy novelist anymore, he's going to die in a year, but he'll write maybe a paragraph, and that's a chapter. The next day he'll get interested, perhaps, and idly write 3 pages. So that's a whole other little chapterette. And then when he's piled up enough of these little chapterettes to account for like a season, or an idea, or some passage that he meant to cover in mind's eye, chronologically. When he's done with that, then he'll move on. So, he had, actually this one, book 7 had just one long section of several pages in which he's quoting his journal, which I read from and ended. Then the second of the little chapterettes in book 7, but my hands weren't sea-netted and chapped by rope and wire, as later the next year as deckhand. At present time I was a scullion. I'd vaguely heard of Shakespeare yelling about that. He who washes pots and scours out giant pans with greasy apron, hair hanging in face like idiot, face splattered by dishwater, scouring not with a scourer, as you and I understand it, but with a goddamn slave chain, grouped in fist as chain, scratch, scrouch, and the whole galley heaving slowly. Oh, the pots and pans and racket of their fear, the kitchen of the sea, the Neptunes down there, the herds of sea cows want to milk us, the sea poem I ain't finished with, the fear of the Scottish laird rowing out with the nape of another's fox's neck in the leeward church of Howl, yon Irish sea, the sea of her lip, the brattle of her bony, the crack of Noah's Ark's timbers built by Mosaic Schwartz in the unconditional night of universal death. Short chapter, part 3. So it's just a little piece of writing, which didn't lead anywhere, so he said, or it led to a little lyric, but nowhere in terms of the narrative, but a little bit in terms of the statement, but he didn't eliminate it or make anything, just a short chapter. And in this book, it's funny, there's a lot of little comments on the writing. Proceed to book 5. The writing is so easy, it's almost like a little negligent. I remember that phrase he was saying, and I idly then became tossed off a play, and idly then. So this writing is very idle, like idle tales told to his wife in old age. As it begins, well, wifey dear, now I'll tell you. So because he's just talking to his wife, he doesn't have to be a great literateur. He can just idly make whatever little nonsensical ditties he wants to. Well, I think it was a little hard for him to write, rack my hand with labor of nada, because he didn't, see, writing about this was probably tough, because what he had to do was judge his youth time. And finally comes to the conclusion to say, vanity of Duluth was a lot of shit. What did it come to? Nothing. Which is, I read from the last chapter, he's saying, what did it all come to? Nothing. I did it all through 1,200 pages and nothing. Alcohol and see body pain, brain see rack or something. So that actually writing it must have been a little bit psychologically difficult until maybe when he finally sat down, it was like falling off a log because he didn't believe in anything anymore. So all he had to do was remember a few details and occasionally apply himself, like look up his old journals, write it down, then make funny little comments like, oh, gee. But loose and relaxed, really honest, because he didn't care. He no longer was maintaining his mythology. In fact, he mentions in this book, and among mythologers, I'm an expert, he says, at one point. I'll get to that later. Where he demythologizes, in a sense, or his last mythology, he demythologizes his own, at least in his own head. So that there's a quality in this book which is really delightful, truthful of that. And if you're interested in writing, pure writing, there's that delightful playfulness, negligence, the word idle he used, comes through very clearly in this. It is a good, anybody can be that idle and careless. Is really like an accomplished master that, with few strokes really has done it so much that he really knows how to turn a phrase, and finally will maybe turn a phrase just to turn a phrase when there's nothing to talk about particularly, just the pleasure of turning a phrase. And where did he get that? Those phrases, that sound. It's an interesting composite. You may notice that the sea of her lip, the brattle of her bony, the shower of yon Irish sea. There's a little element of Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, and Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake were also great archetypes for him among writing. I guess Woolf and Joyce originally, and then later Céline, maybe Genet. Woolf, Joyce, and Céline probably, but as a kid, Woolf and Joyce, and Shakespeare. So this is like Woolf, Joyce, and Shakespeare. But how does it get articulated in everyday talk like this? He heard it out of Lucian Carr's mouth. These are imitations of the sounds of Lucian Carr talking a little bit drunk. Hey, Kerouac, the trouble with you is you never got away from your mother's apron string, and you might as well go back there to Lowell and bury your nose in the old-time Boston cod instead of coming around to New York and twirling your little butt around in the United Press. Something like that. It's sort of drunken newspaperman talk. Or the tone, actually, I would characterize it as a tone characteristic. It's a tone characteristic of alcohol. Alcoholic newsmen. Why, you never seen any revolutions in Guatemala like I seen revolutions in Guatemala? Have you ever heard newsmen talking about their Costa Rican tragedies over a beer on 3rd Avenue in New York? Arguing over whose journalistic macho-hood was more magniloquent. And I think Kerouac got all that playfulness there. Then Lucian also, as he mentions in here, had a real pure tongue, a beautiful tongue, and was we all considered him the great Shakespearean tongue among us, and he never actually did write anything, except little things that entered into our writing. And he wrote most of the news that we've been reading for the last 30 years over the United Press, actually. He edited all that. So actually his volume of literature is much vaster and invisible. But Lucian finally concluded that he didn't want to cast any shadow, unlike us egotists. He said, I got my life full enough, I don't need to cast a shadow. Kinsey, you need to cast a shadow of some sort? This is very similar to the Trungpa statement, you can't watch your own death. As a criteria of egolessness, you can't watch your own death.
What did Lucian Carr work as?
The night bureau manager of the New York United Press at the moment, as of 1945 or 6. So all this time he's been sitting at one desk doing that. Said, well, when the Martians arrive, I want to be there to report it. I had various reasons for that, but recently there have been a lot of biographical works on Kerouac, which Carr has been friendly and participated, but setting his own ground rules and limiting his own shadow. So I always feel a little uncertain when I'm talking about him because he doesn't want to cast a shadow, and it's kind of like an invasion of his privacy. Except that everybody loved him so much, and he was so central to everybody's mythology that it's hard to give a course in the literary history of the Beat Generation without adducing his tongue as part of the literary background, actually. The great document of that, or documentation of that, is a text called Old Lucian Midnight, which was later retitled Old Angel Midnight, and written in the late 50s, and published, I think, almost complete in the Big Table issue of 1958-59. Where's that republished in? Do you know, Paul? Old Angel Midnight. Where is that in a book? Is that in Lonesome Traveler?
No, it's in the green folder.
I'll tell you.
Is not collected in?
It's a private edition. It's not in any longer.
Yeah.
I was in England last summer and I found a copy of that printed by a small press in Wales.
Old Angel Midnight. Yeah. I think two parts exist. There's one part in Big Table. I think that's a major chunk. And then there was some little more added in Evergreen Review. And I don't know where you'll find the whole thing. That would be a great thing to... I think Ferlinghetti once wanted to put it out. Or Kerouac wanted Ferlinghetti to put it out, and Ferlinghetti didn't want it for some reason or other. He didn't understand it. Well, so it was Kerouac's Lucianesque gibber-ish. A Joycean Finnegan's Wake style, unconscious language. Really pretty. Based mainly on Lucian's language, which he seemed to hear Shakespeare through Lucian Carr's speech. And there's a real interesting Mexico City Blues, which maybe is like a summary of all that. See if I can find it. Give me a second. It begins, Soledad Smarty Pines came prapping down my line of least regard, last prappitude, and what do you think old Father Time made of him? A western sponnet without no top on bonnet, trapping the cock at his time of the nigh. It's just sort of like some mixture of Shakespeare, Lucian Carr, and W.C. Fields. Here it is. "2/17 chorus. Oh, that's where Rack My Hand with Labor of Nada comes from. Soledad Smarty Pines came prapping down my line, at least regard last prappitude, and what do you think old Father Time made of him? A western sponnet without no false on bonnet, trapping the cock at his time of the nigh. Slight the leak of recompense, being hermaphrodized by finey wild trap hoods and all their estapular glories, gleaming there, shining rising spears against the high thap all thup. So I aim my gazuda always toward the god, remembering the origin of all beasts and cod, Bostonian by nature, with no mind of my own, could write about railroads, quietus these blues, hurt my hand more, rack my hand with labor of nada, run 100-yard dash in old Ensenada. So what'll I have to do? This gin and tonics, persimmonics, twabble all day. Which, I don't know if that makes sense to you. I've heard it so often that it clear as a bell. But old soldier Smarty Pants, Soledad Smarty Pines, came farting down my... Came prapping. Oh, Soledad Smarty Pants came prapping down. Soledad Smarty Pants came parading, farting down. My line of least regard, last prappitude, last Friday, came. Soldier Smarty Pants, soldier egotistical Smarty Pants came parading himself down my line of least regard, my line of fire, my line of indifference last Friday, or prep duty. And what do you, so Soldier Smarty Pines came parading himself down my view last Sunday, and what do you think time made out of him? A Western bonnet without no false on bonnet. A Western, well, whatever a bonnet is, a Western skeleton, a Western spun nut, a Western sparrow, a Western sonnet, with no more false on his bonnet. Cleaned his brains away or emptied them out. A Western, what do you think old Father Time made of him? A Western bonnet without no false on bonnet. How? He was trapped in the cock at his time of the nigh. Trap in the cock, A-D-U-S. Trap in the cock, A-D-U-S, time of the nigh. Trap in the cock at his time of the nigh. He's just imitating a Shakespeare sonnet and writing anything that comes in his mind. But what comes out is trap in the cock at this time. Trapped in his body, trapped in his cock at this time, at the time of the nigh, at the time of apocalypse, resurrection, or at the time of judgment. Trapped in the cock at his time of the nigh. Slight, the leak of recompense being hermaphrodized by finey wild trap hoods and all their estapulars glories. Slight the leak of recompensatory pleasure or compensatory pleasure in being a hero, being hermaphrodited or homogenized out or being spread out by all these fine, wild, heroic, karmic trap hoods in all their bloody glories, in all their estapular glories, or estapular, whatever estapular means. Estapular. Puling estates, I don't know. But is all this making sense? I mean, is everybody understanding what this is about? Or not? Raise your hand if not. Raise your hand if it's making some osmosis of sense. Yeah, okay, an osmosis of sense. It's attitudinal partly, but also there are hints in puns. He's talking about, actually, Lucian Carr, saying, old Lucian Carr came parading down my line of least regard, the other Prabhupada, a beautiful wild hero with all his fine wild trap hood and all his glory. And what do you think old Father Time made of him? Just knocked his brains out, cleaned out his ego, and tore him down. Down. Trapped in his cock at the time of the judgment, with very little glory, pleasure, bliss, compensation spread out in his fine wild trap hood and all that glory. Slight the leak of recompense being hermaphrodized by finey wild trap hoods and all their estapular glories. Gleaming there, shining rising spears against the high thap-all thup. Any individual gleaming his individual sword, prick sword against the vagina of the great void. Well, no, against the high thap-all thup, against the great Gazuda, against the old Nobodaddy, against bleak, against bleak God, bleak heaven. Gleaming their shining rising spears against the high thap-all thup. Vast academies of Kerouacos trying to interpret beat literatures in the void. Gleaming their shining rising spears against the high thap-all thup. So I, Kerouac, aim my Gazuda always toward the God, remembering the origin of all beasts and cod. My Gazuda, I don't know what, his pen, his prick, his Gazuda, prayer. Gazoo has no mind of my own. So, okay, there being no recompense, no very slight leak of recompense being hermaphrodized for all this fine, wild literary traphood karma. What's it all about? Since there is no glory and no individuality, and everybody must get stoned and torn down. What am I supposed to do? Write about railroads? Quietus these blues? Hurt my hand more? Rack my hand with labor of nada? Write my rack is pain my hand with labor of nothing. Nada, Spanish nada, nothing. Rack, I like the vowels. Rack my hand with labor of nada. 100-yard dash in old Ensenada. It's like that vanity fantasy he already did. Like he got to be the fastest runner in the world and the biggest novelist, and then finally wound up. The fantasy bubble burst and he was sitting back home. So what do I have to do, this gin and tonics? Well, drink some gin and tonics, twab, twab, twabble all day. Finally reduces all that poetry to twab, twab, twabble all day. Or soldier smarty pines is just twab, twab, twabbling all day. Very much. So it's like a mixture of all the bop stuff, and plus this is specifically Lucian Carr's speech that he's parodying. I chose this because it'll be a sample of what you'll meet if you try and read the prose of Old Angel Midnight. It's really good. It's funny. It's just, drunken talk, but all the sounds of talk. So you don't have to worry about what it means, except it's got this, all sorts of suggestions in the syllables and in the associations and the puns. It's just about, actually what it is Sunday afternoon in the universe with all the sounds. Sunday afternoon in the universe with all the sounds of the universe coming in the window of the mind, or of the ear. Just all the sounds of the universe coming in the window of the ear. That's from the beginning page of Old Angel Midnight. As I say, originally Old Lucian Midnight, because it was Lucian's sound that he was interested in. Then the next page, 125, after all that short chapter of pure babble. Well, okay. None of the adolescent scribblings of that time I kept in journals will do us now. So then you got to write something real interesting right now, of now, as prose now. So the next chapter is a series of sort of very playful series of one-sentence paragraphs. I mean, it's really a totally like a spontaneously playful book, if you can see it here. I don't know, at any distance, whether you read it or not. It's just simply that from that Joycean Angel Midnight babble, then he decided, well, now I'll write a series of exactly perfect sentence paragraphs. Maybe they won't make any sense, but in our case, it meant $500 if we got back safe and free, and that was a lot of money in 1942. Next paragraph. The barefoot Indian deckhand toured every forecastle of dust to make sure the portholes were closed and secured. Next paragraph. He had a dagger in his belt. Next paragraph. Two Negro cooks had a big fight in the galley at midnight over gambling that I didn't see, where they swung huge butcher knives at each other. Next paragraph. A little Moro chieftain turned third cook with small neck, swiveled and shriveled when he turned to see. Next paragraph. He had the biggest knife of them all in his belt, a first-degree Swami machete from old Mindanao. Next paragraph. The pastry cook was advertised as gay, and they said he belted off his gun in the mixings for all of us to enjoy. Next paragraph. In the steward's linen department, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, member of the Abraham Lincoln left-wing anti-fascist brigade, tried to make a communist out of me. Next paragraph. The chief steward had no more use for me than a piece of foam of the sea hath use for him or me or anybody. Well, so it's just sort of like a funny playfulness there, paragraph, one line each. It's a variety of, you can do anything. You know what you're saying? In prose, you can do anything. As long as you're doing it. As long as you're there and you're doing it, you do anything. It doesn't make, you don't have to fit into anybody's rules. You don't even have to make sense. You don't have to make a story. As long as you are so grounded and so there that, you know, you're demonstrating the delight of mind, or disillusion of mind, whatever, the emptiness of mind. Yes, it's a demonstration of the emptiness of mind, the emptiness of art. So accomplished that it's completely empty and you can do anything you want. Doesn't make any difference. I had that labeled as playful short paragraphs. But every once in a while he gets such great phrasing. It's like high poetry. Boy, we didn't like each other. I went to this is on page 135. I went to the second mate asking to be transferred to deck, but they refused. I was trapped on a steel jail floating in the icy oceans of the Arctic Circle and a slave at last. It's a funny self-vision. I was trapped on a steel, he's on a ship, down in the galley. I was trapped in a steel jail floating on the icy oceans of the Arctic Circle and a slave at last. It's a funny little vision. I mean, everybody has little visions of themselves in some final, as in some ultimate finality moment of today or yesterday. Here, it's a little Acme vision of trapped on a steel jail floating in the icy oceans of the Arctic Circle, a slave. So he got into that. He was able to see himself in that role. On 138, he has a funny exaggerative phraseology for women sometimes. Duke and I were headed the opposite way from the rest of the guys who were headed for the Eskimo settlement. It was not long before we had joined into discussion on mountain climbing as being more immediate than trying to lay some old blubber-smeared monster, so we decided to go. Some old blubber-smeared monster. So, an Eskimo girl, I suppose some Eskimo girl that the other crewmen were going after. A blubber-smeared monster. Yeah. It was just that phrase was great. Sebastian Sampras, who was an early poetic inspiration, let's see. Kerouac has gone crazy in the Army, or the Navy, I think, and is in he's now, the war is on, he's in a Navy psycho ward. Irritated, I think. Just given up. I think he's just given up on it. He decided the world is crazy and he doesn't want to have any part to do with it. And just wants to be a novelist, but he doesn't want to have any truck with the world or its responsibility. So then his father visits him, and then Sebastian Sampras, his old youth time Shelleyan, poetic, idealistic fellow friend. Then in comes Sabby in a U.S. Army uniform, sad, idealistic, crew-cutted now, but dream-minded, trying to talk to me. I have remembered, Jack. I have kept faith. But the nutty manic depressive from West Virginia shoves him in a corner and grabs him by his private sleeves and yells, "Wabash, cannonball!" in Sabby's eyes, and poor Sabby's eyes are misting and looking at me saying, "I came here to talk to you. I have only 20 minutes. What a house of suffering. What now?" I say, "Come to the toilet. Come in the toilet." West Virginia follows us, yelling. It was one of his good days. I say, "Sabby, don't worry. The kid's okay. Everybody's okay. Besides," I added, "there's nothing for me or you to say, except, I suppose, that time when Bartlett Junior High School was burning down and my train was taking me back to New York prep school and you ran alongside, remember, in the snowstorm, singing, 'I'll see you again,' in all the old familiar places." Huh? And that was the last time I saw Sabby. He was fatally wounded on Anzio Beachhead after that. He was a medical corpsman. So that's a late farewell to, I think, the person he felt closest to as a poet who died young. So that's Kerouac's a legend of the lost, pure, innocent poet. And I think there was a great love they had. I remember when I first went out, finally got admitted to Kerouac's house through his mother's wall of disapproval, and Kerouac had a record from Sebastian Sampras that Sampras had sent him from Italy. It was an old, scratchy pop commercial record that you could make on a little machine for $1 back during the war. Like, you record your voice and send it home to your family. So it was a recording of Sampras in a youthful voice saying, "I weep for Adonais. He is dead. Oh, Jack, I weep for Adonais. He is dead." And then going on and reading the end of Shelley's Adonais. But beginning with, "I weep for Adonais. He is dead," which was like prophetical, which moved Jack because news of Sampras's death arrived maybe a few months after he got that record from Italy, or maybe made in London, probably made in London, as samples were shipped overseas and wound up in Italy and died around some time after he got that little scratchy record, which is probably around as the only record of Sebastian Sampos's voice in some attic in Lowell, where Stella Kerouac, his widow, is keeping some manuscripts that are yet unpublished. Incidentally, if you want to follow the sequence of his writings, the chronology, I guess there are bibliographies, but if you look in the dedication in Howl, there's, I think, an accurate listing of the books written between after Town and the City, 1950 and 1953, and written between 1950 and 1956, which was a period of enormous production. I think he did 12 or 13 books.
When he named that, did he make up the name Howl for that poem? Did he give you that title?
Not quite like that. Yes, he gave me the idea, but gave me the word. But I sent him the poem, and his reply was, "I received your howl," underlined. I received your howl for Carl Sullivan.
Did you have another title before that?
No, I didn't.
No.
Didn't have any particular. I hadn't thought about it, but then he said, "I received your howl." I said, "Well, that would be nice."
Like I think Charter said he was the verbal sorcerer or something, like naming Naked Lunch and Howl.
No, it wasn't sorcery at all. It was just such funny, ordinary mind common sense. Like in the middle of a longer letter, you know, he wanted to tell me that he got the manuscript. And he said, and also shrewdly, he had read it and got it, and you know, I guess the word occurred to him, and he said, "I received your howl," and he underlined it and capitalized it. So it was like characterizing it, and with a suggestion, without even making it overtly, that that's the title. But it wasn't, you know, a big sorcery thing. It was just sort of smart, just ordinary, you know, smart. Funny sentence here I never understood. I guess that night on the train trip, this is page 166, that night on the train trip to Washington, we were left alone in separate sleeping compartments while the corpseman waited outside, and I took the opportunity to fantasize, or that is, to relieve myself of the horror of masculinity. I guess jack off. To relieve myself of the horror of masculinity. Heart and kiss is only something sung by gals. He mentions in the middle of the book that the book comes to a certain pivotal point and changes while he's writing it. He's aware of it while writing it. So I want to read a couple lines. What I'm pointing to here is since there's that quality of empty playfulness, since there's that quality of empty playfulness in this particular novel, the most finished work that he put together, it's really odd how he knows what he's doing, or he decides that once he's written something that's it, and so you better tell the reader. I said, after I make my break and may not sink anything, and you miss some dumb choice, it's a little conversation about football among the team. I'll slice the first ball into the corner with a little scythe, as soft as your devil. Answer, and therefore you're the devil. Kerouac, no, I'm his wind, and I'm gone as much from his influence as this ungraspable handshake. This is where the book, the story, pivots. This is known by Massachusetts Yankees as deep form. Quote, deep form, unquote. Funny halfbacks don't have to sell Pepsi-Cola. He himself is a funny halfback. He can go on and be a novelist instead of going on like the rest of the halfbacks get fat and old selling Pepsi-Cola. Funny halfbacks don't have to sell Pepsi-Cola. Book 10. It pivots in the sense that All this is his Horace Mann high school days, the first half, and then gets on into New York, Burroughs, and Lucian Carr, Hunky, myself. This is where the book pivots. He just decided it then and there, well, I better get into the story, and so he tells the reader. It's a little bit about his Catholicism here, and God, his notions of God, and which I thought was pretty good because he's just, at a late time, summarizing thoughts, philosophical thoughts, after a long time being in Buddhist thinking, a long time being in Catholic thinking, finally, again, emptily making a few conclusions, negligently. Because when I saw the face of my beloved dead cat, this is page 176, because when I saw the face of my beloved dead cat Timmy in the heavens, and heard him mew like he used to do in a little voice, it surprised me to realize he wasn't even born when World War II was on, and therefore at this moment, how can he even be dead? If he wasn't born, how can he be dead? So just an apparition in molecular form for a while, to haunt our souls with similarities to God's perfection. In Timmy's case, the perfection was when he'd sit like a lion on the kitchen table, paw straight out, head erect and full jowled, and God's imperfection when he was dying and his back was a skeletal run of ribs and spinal joints, and his fur falling off and his eyes looking out at me. Quite, I quote, I may have loved you, I may love you now, but it's too late, unquote. Pascal says it better than I do when he says, what shall we gather from all our darkness, if not a conviction of our unworthiness? And then he adds, to show you the right path, there are perfections of nature which demonstrate that she is the image of God. Timmy sitting like a lion, Big Slim in his prime, Pop in his prime, me in my careless 1943 youth, you, all. And imperfections, our decay and going down, all of us, to assure us that she is no more than his image, that nature is no more than the image of God. In Kerouac's comment, I believe that. God is dead made everybody sick to their stomachs because they all know what I just said, and Pascal said, and Pascal means resurrection. And Pascal, the philosopher said, and Pascal, P-A-S-C-H-A-L, Pascal Lamb means resurrection. So it's a little Catholic statement there. But just from a sort of aesthetic point of view, God is dead made everybody sick to their stomachs. That's like a final comment on that. On that as an intellectual thesis. There was when we got together at that time, I mentioned last time there was supreme reality as an ideal, 1945. I think that was, I think Kerouac and I both used that phrase as being the new vision that we were chasing after. There was a phrase, new vision, coming probably from Lucian Carr, carrying around Yeats's A Vision, and coming from the paragraph in Rimbaud's Season in Hell, which goes, when shall we, I can't quote it, but when shall we, after much suffering, after many seasons, arrive and be the first to see Christmas on earth, first to greet Christmas on earth forever. Slaves, let us not curse life. Noël sur la terre, Christmas on earth. Like a little visionary moment in Rimbaud that was so poignant and sweet and sad, because he failed to make it, but we decided we were going to make it. So we wanted Christmas on earth. So out of Yeats's vision, out of Rimbaud's phrase Christmas on earth, about 1945, we concocted, and as I said, out of the notion of unity of being, we concocted, I say because we talked about it. I think it was my obsession, but Kerouac used the phrase also, supreme reality, as being what we were chasing after. I thought, for instance, I heard a big fist fight. He's in a boat, on page 184. I thought, for instance, I heard a big fist fight and wrestling rough and tumble on the steel deck right over my pillow one morning. 50 guys fighting with clubs and sledgehammers, but it was pooey, 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 the scream of the all hands on deck attack warning. And I realized I was listening to the depth charges going off in a submarine attack. I just turned over and went back to sleep. Not because we had 500-pound bombs and couldn't do anything about anything anyhow, but because I was just naturally sleepy and I had figured out in the Navy, not house, quote, I could get killed walking across the street if supreme realities arranged it, so why not go to sea? And besides, ding blast it, I was just simply sleepy all the time. They called me Sleepy Delouse, Sleepy Kerouac. Like Beetle Belly, you might say. Zzz, z, 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 z. The chapter ends snoring sounds. But I could get killed walking across the street if supreme realities arrange it, so why not just go to sea? I just noticed that supreme reality with a capital S and a capital R. Speaking of his sleepiness, that was a characteristic thing, just like cutting out of a scene which got too complicated, or a job which got too complicated, or a situation which seemed to be unresolvable. You simply drop it and go out and go south. I had that experience in another form of like him pulling the covers over his head and turning over and going to sleep. In 1945, I guess it was. I had just written a long poem which has never been published because it was too much doggerel.